The Founding Fathers knew that, like any other part of the government, the power of the judiciary could be abused. They never intended, for example, that the courts preempt legislative prerogatives or become vehicles for political action or social experimentation, or for coercing the populace into adopting anyone's personal view of utopia. Now, during the past 2 presidential elections, I've made it clear to the American public that I felt the courts had sometimes gone too far in interfering with the constitutional prerogatives of the branch.
I'm very pleased to congratulate the Federalist Society on the occasion of its 25th anniversary. I doubt that those who met on law school campuses 25 years ago to found the Society could have envisioned the current level of its membership or the number of chapters around the country.
By design, the structural features of our Constitution are essential to the protection of liberty and human dignity, placing a premium on property rights and freedom, and a preference for free markets rather than centralized government control.
The Founding Fathers understood that throughout history, governments have often put their own ambitions and convenience above the freedom of the individual and the laws of God.
Somewhere along the way, our legal system took a wrong turn, occasionally at the hands of well-meaning people who were looking to address injustices, and other times at the instigation of those seeking to use the justice system as a tool for their own brand of social and political engineering. Decades of liberal orthodoxy resulted in courts that too often failed to interpret the text of the Constitution as it was written by the Founding Fathers, and judges who failed to respect their limited role in relation to the democratic process under our Constitution.
I intend to go right on appointing highly qualified individuals of the highest personal integrity to the bench, individuals who understand the danger of short-circuiting the electoral process.
In the law schools, future lawyers are taught not that the courts are bulwarks of the Constitution, but that they are vehicles for social change to be used when the people refuse to vote as certain groups would like.
The rule of law was no longer the rule. On law school campuses across the country, legal argument became a strictly one-sided affair.
If you're sitting there wondering what you've just gotten yourself into, this is your last chance to leave before I tell you about another group of people just making stuff up and calling it law to justify being an asshole. Actually, I'm pretty sure that's why you're here, so let's cut to the chase. Who or what is the Federalist Society? Well, FedSoc or FedSoc, depending on who you're talking to, certainly isn't your friend. Now, I can't say I'm your friend either. Come on, we probably don't even know each other. I'm reading a 30-something page Word document to my phone for the second time. Please, somebody help me. Regardless, my name is Clementine. I'm a queer with she, they pronouns and a JD, which officially makes me conservative's favorite gender. Annoying. I'll throw my normal disclaimer here. I don't know everything, and I won't get everything right. The only way to learn is by being wrong and growing from those mistakes. If you have an issue with any of that, this probably isn't the channel for you. Getting back on track. You're probably hoping for a better explanation of who or what FedSoc is than me repeating the title of the essay again and again. Why don't we ask the Federalist Society for a definition? I'm sure they'll have something to say about themselves. Dear Federalist Society, what are you?
Federalist Society is an organization of 90,000 lawyers, law students, scholars, and other individuals who believe and trust that individual citizens can make the best choices for themselves and society. It was founded in 1982 by a group of law students interested in making sure that the principles of limited government embodied in our Constitution receive a fair hearing.
Well, alright then. Those are definitely words, but I'm not entirely sure what that means. So what if I ask it like this? Dear Federalist Society, how do you do whatever it is that the Federalist Society does?
The Society's main purpose is to sponsor fair, serious, and open debate about the need to enhance individual freedom and the role of courts in saying what the law is rather than what they wish it to be. We believe debate is the best way to ensure that legal principles that have not been the subject of sufficient attention for the past several decades receive a fair hearing.
Okay, I feel like we're almost getting somewhere, and then these answers start to dissolve into lawyer speak that makes whatever they're doing seem immensely boring and mundane. Can I get a straight answer about who joins the Federalist Society?
Many prominent lawyers, law students, and scholars in America are members or are involved with our work. Membership is open to anyone who wishes to join the society, and the organization attracts people who share a desire for public service.
Oh wait, they made a video. I'm sure that would be better.
The Federalist Society is a beacon of hope for conservative and libertarian lawyers that believe in a constitutionally based federal government and a judiciary that says what the law is as opposed to what it should be.
Okay, that's it. I'm so over this website and asking lawyers to answer a question in a straightforward way. I've been to law school. I know the game these motherfuckers play. I know how to cut through the BS. And with a little bit of help, I'm going to teach you how to do the same. The Federalist Society is not your friend. They exist for the sole purpose of creating legal and cultural legitimacy for conservative ideas. The Federalist Society's explicit goal is to make bigoted legal theories seem normal, rational, and even like a moderate compromise compared to the ideas of the radical left. And when they say radical left, they're talking about the Bill Clinton neoliberal type lawyers.
When I was in England, I experimented with marijuana a time or two, and I didn't like it, and didn't inhale, and never tried it again.
That's too left-wing for FedSoc. Now, the really interesting thing about FedSoc is that they'll just tell you what their objective is. They aren't shy about it in any way, but people end up missing what's being said because FedSoc dresses their ideas up in a suit and tie, hands them a degree from a fancy-sounding law school, and then credentials them upon graduation. That's how you get Justice Clarence Thomas blaming poverty on
personal responsibility and victim status.
Once again, being here, the Federalist Society is important, and it's important to be a part of such a timely conference and timely issue. I would like to begin by returning to the topic that Leonard mentioned, and the topic that I touched on in my last speech at a conference co-sponsored by this organization, and that is personal responsibility. It said something about the current state of affairs in our society that a conference on victims and on the rise of the practice of blaming circumstances for one situation rather than taking responsibility for changing things for the better is even necessary.
Just don't be poor.
That's what Thomas desperately wants to say, but it's not very lawyerly to publicly say,
it's your fault for being born poor.
So what we get instead is an hour-long speech that says the same thing in a far less direct way. And I'm sure Justice Thomas follows his own advice. It's pretty easy to not be poor when you have a billionaire sugar daddy. Old habits die hard, and seeing as I'm also trained as a lawyer, I'm going to explain a bit about the structure and methodology of this essay. By the end of this video, I want you to be able to see through the lawyer BS, to really hear what the Federalist Society is saying, and to understand that there is no reason to treat them as a serious, good faith legal organization. To do that, I'm going to play a lot of clips from FedSoc. All things that they've published so that you can hear what they want you to hear. Then I'm going to use Amanda Hollis-Brusky's book, Ideas with Consequences, to explain the political science behind what FedSoc is doing. And for the first time, I'm bringing on a special guest. To get another perspective on the Federalist Society, I interviewed my good friend from law school, Legally Anonymous, aka my lawyer. She's actually a licensed attorney. She had so many insights, and this video wouldn't be the same without her. I think that's enough prologue, so let's start where any good originalist would, with the history and tradition and what we can glean from the text, or in this case, the film. Play a clip.
The Federalist Society was founded by students who believed the rule of law and the Framers' Constitution deserved a place in law schools. They realized that the prospect of transforming the legal culture and furthering limited constitutional government would have to start with inspiring the hearts and minds of law students and young lawyers. The idea was simple yet effective. Education through open-minded debate. Testing ideas, deepening curiosity and enthusiasm, and finding truth by discussing real issues from different points of view, including those they didn't necessarily agree with.
One thing that we learned in law school is that ideas are very important in driving the legal process and in producing changes in legal doctrines. And we found that there were no people who were talking about the ideas that we cared about the most, that we thought were the most important.
We were very frustrated to find that on the law school campuses there was no conservative or libertarian student organization, and we were very frustrated that conservative ideas weren't being heard. We wanted very much to see some of the ideas that President Reagan was bringing to Washington brought to the law school campuses.
What started as a set of small on-campus Federalist Society clubs quickly took on a broader and more overarching role in the legal system.
it also had a major impact on the law and the legal profession itself. First of all, by providing, again, a counterpoint to some of the liberal approaches of the American Bar Association, then becoming a watchdog in regard to the ABA, and then, of course, providing an opportunity for lawyers who had enjoyed their law school experience in the Federalist Society to continue in the same vein.
The natural outgrowth of the Federalist Society's successful educational work on law school campuses is a growing infrastructure of lawyers across the nation. The Society is building a community of legal opinion leaders who have a deep appreciation for the rule of law as guaranteed by our constitutional system, and who are committed to fostering the application of this idea in the legal, judicial, and policy worlds. Through its work on law school campuses and through thousands of citizen lawyers practicing at all levels of the law, the Federalist Society is bringing change, airing the issues in open, honest debate, bringing different sides together for meaningful, respectful dialogue, and returning to an emphasis on the rule of law, structural constitution, limited government, and freedom. The need for honest, open debate will continue to grow in importance and relevance well into the future. For 25 years, the Federalist Society has fostered limited constitutional government through spirited open debate, working to reorder priorities within the legal system, to place a premium on individual liberty, traditional values, and the rule of law. Since the 1970s, we as a country have moved closer to these ideals. There's much more to be done. But as the Society celebrates a quarter century, there's a sense of optimism and hope in knowing that an already large community of conservative and libertarian students and lawyers continues to grow, making their mark in the legal, judicial, and policy worlds. And so we celebrate the past as well as the promise of a future, one where respect for our Constitution as it was written, and for limitations on government power bestow the blessings of the rule of law on generations of Americans to come. The Federalist Society will continue to play its unique role, for debate brings together differing opinions. Debate lets us test new ideas. Debate moves the argument forward and leads us to the truth.
I was in DC for a semester, and at one of the universities there, the way that the semester was structured was that we were required to have an internship, because we spent 2 days in class, 2.5 days in class, and then the rest of the week we had to be at this internship. And I came to DC, and some people had internships. I did not have ADHD, so I, of course, procrastinated the hell out of that. So we had like a little internship fair, and I was just walking around. And at that point, I knew I wanted to go to law school, but like I hadn't really thought that plan out much because I was 20 years old, and that seemed like a problem for later me. And I like came to the booth, and this is gonna be embarrassing to admit. Hamilton was really big, so like all the things with the Federalist Papers, like I had read the Federalist Papers for class like a few months earlier, and I was all into it. I was so into it. I saw Federalist Society, I was like, oh my god, they've got like Hamilton in the outline of the thing. I was like, this is for me. This is a sign. So I started talking to the I guess the like person that was there that they had sent, because this was like the DC office, and she was really nice. We actually bonded over Hamilton. So I was like, oh my god, this is great, like a nerd. And she didn't really go into a whole lot of detail. It's a legal think tank. That's all really I knew about this thing.
The Federalist Society does several things. First, it educates. It teaches people, law students, lawyers, interested members of the public, about what our Constitution means, why it's important today, and why limitations on government power are so important.
This should have been my first warning. When she was like, we like to look at the founding intent, let's study the documents, and see what it means today. And I was like, yeah, okay, I can get with that. I was kind of desperate for an internship because I was getting like a little worried that I wasn't going to have one, and the other places I applied to were really slow to call back. In all honesty, I probably wasn't patient enough because this was like within the span of 2 days. I felt bad. I was with like all my friends that already had internships, so I was like, okay, I need to get on this. And I made it pretty clear, like early on, about where I was aligned politically. And they actually were very receptive towards that, which surprised me.
The Federalist Society is the only organization fully 100% committed to unrestrained, no-holds-barred debate.
None of the professors are conservative where I attend law school. Most of the students are liberal, but I believe that their ideas can be changed. They're simply mimicking what they've learned. They don't know why they believe what they do.
In the meanwhile, I finally went home and I had an interview for her, and she was like, I don't know how to tell you this. I was texting my professor that was like, if you join FedSoc, I'm disowning you. And I was like, well, This is the only place that's offered me an internship so far, so I'm going to take it. I am afraid and I have anxiety.
Alright, let's take a second to recap what FedSoc has told us about itself. We heard Steve Calabrese, one of the founding members of FedSoc, say ideas are very important twice. The first time was from 1986, just 4 years after he helped found FedSoc, and the second time was from the Society's 25th anniversary. To that end, we also heard that conservatives saw themselves as a minority on law school campuses. They felt that the liberal students and professors were mimicking liberal orthodoxy without really knowing what they believed. Based on that conclusion, the obvious next step was forming an organization to share conservative ideas with the people who were seeking them. FedSoc members will tell you it's the only organization committed to no-holds-barred debate, that it's a beacon of hope for conservatives and libertarians. But everything all comes back to the fact that FedSoc educates people on the law and the original meaning of the Constitution. Put more succinctly, that courts should say what the law is and not what the law should be. Okay, I feel like we're finally starting to get some real answers here, compared to the corporate bleh that they put on their website. We know ideas really matter, and that conservatives felt like a minority, but that doesn't get us to 6 Supreme Court justices with deep FedSoc ties. I still feel like we're missing something. Back to the tape.
We use a lot of scholarship, published papers, blog posts, speakers, and events on a variety of topics. We do these all across the country.
One of the core aspects of what the Society does is to engage in a lot of student programming at law school campuses across the nation. We bring in speakers from both sides of any particular legal question or issue to have serious, high-profile debate.
We start with young, talented law students, move them through our campus chapters, integrate them into our lawyers chapters around the country upon graduation, and provide a community that's the backbone for finding opportunities to foster the application of our principles.
I've lectured at about 10 top law schools in this country for the Federalist Society. And that small nucleus of conservative law students is really changing the debate in the law schools in this country. And I think these are the kind of law students that the top law firms in the country would seek out, and these are the kinds of students that would certainly be candidates for judgeships in this country. It is also important to note that the liberal students are getting a different point of view. Even in the heat of the debate, the Federalist Society students have maintained their posture. And I would just encourage them to continue on with the intellectual debate that I think is changing the legal education system in this country.
They really did give me a lot of substantive assignments, which was surprising. So my professor for the class I was in actually pulled me aside early on and said, hey, I want you to be careful because they're known for just having their interns do book reports. He's like, you're too smart to be doing book reports. I don't want you doing that. And if you're doing that, you need to let me know. We're going to get you something else.
Several of my senior staff members on the Senate Judiciary Committee are members of the Lawyers Division, and I think their participation is essential to keeping in contact with the best legal talent and thinking. In just a moment, you will be hearing from a group of people who have all had first-hand experience with the Lawyers Division and its activities.
Now law students who were in the Federalist Society while they were in law school can graduate, join with established lawyers in the Lawyers Division, and begin to form a real national conservative legal network. Such networking can help ensure that good judges get on not only the federal bench, but on the neglected state benches as well. It can provide legal talent in local controversies, and it can change the intellectual and political atmosphere in which American lawyers practice.
The law was the last of the great disciplines to receive an analysis from the conservative intellectual revival. So its rhythm has been different. The heroic age of the conservative revival was in the 1980s in the defeat of communism. But the heroic age for the struggle to restore the rule of law is right now.
And there it is, credentials and access to power. That's the ingredient we were missing this whole time. So where does this leave us now? Do we all feel like we know what FedSoc is/does? No? Okay, I see you were feeling a bit confused. Like, there's an underlying tension in what FedSoc is saying and doing. Like, how is this society all in on no-holds-barred debate, but also a self-described safe haven and safe space for conservatives? The branding of a debate society that always features both sides of a debate seems a bit at odds with the fact that one of those sides views the organization as a safe haven for their politics. To make better sense of this, let's turn to Amanda Hollis-Brodsky's book, Ideas with Consequences: The Federalist Society and the Conservative Counter-Revolution. Ideas with Consequences is first and foremost an academic text. The project initially began as Hollis-Brodsky's PhD dissertation and steadily grew into what we have today, a book-length analysis of FedSoc based on an archival, ethnographic, and original interview data. Now, I'm going to make an important point here. Holly Zabriskie is not a lawyer. She's a political scientist. I like that. I think Holly Zabriskie's work is made better by the degrees of separation she has from the law and the legal profession. In the United States, law is often treated as a rather insular subject. When you get your undergraduate degree, it is extremely unlikely that you study the law at all. If you do learn about the law, you're likely only learning about what the law is. You're not learning why or how the law came to be. There's probably no discussion of whether the law is good or just. The message is simply that the law is, and there's no real need for you to dig any deeper unless you want to be a practicing lawyer. This static presentation of the law is at best wrong and at worst actively misleading. The law is changing. You don't need me to tell you that, especially after the tear the Supreme Court has been on since Dobbs. It can still be tough to wrap your head around how a major change like that happens when you're only ever being told that the law is the law, that it's up to people smarter than us, lawyers, to do whatever it is that they do to determine what the law is. It's almost as if we're supposed to think of it as some form of ancient magic that only can be understood and harnessed by the wizards, and maybe a few witches, who've been studying and mastering the arcane arts. Well, following that logic, if an average person was to do law, whatever that even means, they'd probably just wind up breaking things and making things worse for everyone along the way. Only way to avoid that outcome is to go to law school and learn the dark arts yourself. Only then, after you've completed your undergraduate degree, scored well enough on the LSAT to get into law school, successfully finish 3 years of law school, pass the bar exam, obtain a job practicing law, and rack up an average of $119,000 student loan, can you start to truly understand the law. I'm here to tell you that's bullshit. You don't need any of that to understand the law, nor is it necessary for you to have a valid opinion on the law. In fact, I think some of the best scholarship and insights we have about the law come from people who never went to law school. For those of you who haven't been, most law students pursue a JD or a Juris Doctor degree in a full-time 3-year program consisting of 90+ credit hours and a variety of professional and experiential requirements. Think classes called lawyering or legal ethics. It's also other things, like the client counseling requirement, which I fulfilled by working at the Ohio Innocence Project for a year. Unlike most other degrees called doctor, the Juris Doctor does not involve writing or defending a dissertation. That's because the JD isn't a research doctorate like the PhDs you're probably thinking about. Instead, the JD is a doctor's degree of professional practice. The degree exists for the sole purpose of training you to join the profession. Put another way, the point is to teach you to think like a lawyer. The logic goes something like, to do law well, you must think like a lawyer. And to think like a lawyer, you must go to law school. That sounds fine and all, but what does it mean to think like a lawyer? And what does doing law even entail? Like, who defines when the law is done well? Those questions don't have good answers. The answer law school often provides is,
just think like a lawyer.
And
this is how we've historically done things, and it's worked up until now. We're sure it'll be fine once you graduate and put what you've learned into practice.
The phrase think like a lawyer practically is the law school mantra. I couldn't tell you how many times I heard the phrase. Hell, I couldn't even tell you how many times I've said it myself. Thinking like a lawyer certainly involves understanding legal concepts and arguments and how to craft them. But it's more to it than that. It's also about understanding the cultural norms and professional norms. In other words, understanding the mechanics of how law is done, understanding why judges take cases, which legal arguments are seen as legitimate and grounded in reality versus those that are seen as off the wall and impossible, knowing you shouldn't protest a campus speech by a bigoted federal judge.
Because you are also not important. You asked for an administrator. She is an administrator. You just asked for an administrator.
You might just send her or want someone
Can I say something to you? Is that okay? Is that okay?
So you've invited me to speak here, and I've been heckled nonstop. And I'm just asking for an administrator. That's
Your racism is showing.
Because that judge is going to make it his mission to ruin your career. Thinking like a lawyer provides an easy excuse for knowing your place in the system and staying put. It's a rationale for maintaining the status quo so that maybe one day you can be in a position of power to change it. And when you're $119,000 in the hole for this degree, I can see why working within those prescribed boundaries is so attractive. That's why I truly value the perspective of people who haven't been to law school. They haven't been taught and encouraged to think like a lawyer for the sake of their career. The law is not some unique intellectual domain unto itself. It's a concept that exists in relation to and with other ideas. If you've seen my last video, you should already know that law and politics are fundamentally intertwined. The easiest way for me to prove this is by asking who writes the laws. The answer is politicians, who are often lawyers, and the lawyers on their staff who actually do the work. That's an incredibly blurry line between law and politics. And in law school, you probably won't even be offered a course on politics. Hell, they'll just play the Schoolhouse Rock clip and call it a day.
I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill.
Law school certainly doesn't teach you how to do any level of political analysis, and it especially doesn't teach you how to do a political analysis of a legal think tank like FedSoc. Halsbrusky doesn't think like a lawyer, and in spite of that, or maybe because of that, she's provided an incredibly insightful analysis of the Federalist Society's influence on the law. A lot of people have struggled to find an accurate label to describe FedSoc, and that's intentional on FedSoc's part. Before we talk about what FedSoc does, we should probably talk about what FedSoc doesn't do.
Unlike a public interest law firm, it does not fund, finance, or staff litigation campaigns, though its individual members do. Dissimilar from an interest group, it does not lobby Congress, support judicial or political candidates, or officially participate in litigation as amici curiae, though its individual members do. Moreover, unlike a think tank, it does not have a full-time staff or residents paid to publish position papers designed to advance or endorse a particular policy position, though its members do this too.
What do they even do? Their individual members sure do a lot of these activities, but the Federalist Society itself is very careful to neither claim nor disclaim the activities of its individual members. Stephen M. Tells describes this as part of the organization's boundary maintenance strategy. A perfect example of this is FedSoc's complete silence on John Eastman, a prominent and long-standing member of the society who was also the legal architect for Trump's insurrection plan. He's still got a contributor page on the website though. Jeez. Okay, so really, what does the organization actually do? Well, the clips we've watched so far all point to one thing: networking and career development to put like-minded people in positions of power with the explicit goal of using the law to achieve their political and ideological goals. Halsbrusky describes the Federalist Society as a political epistemic network, or a P.E.N. A P.E.N. is essentially a group of professionals, in this case lawyers, with a shared set of political beliefs. Halsbrusky further describes P.E.Ns as having 4 characteristics. First, a shared vision of the proper arrangement of social and political life. This one is fairly self-explanatory. For example, many conservatives don't believe that there is a constitutional right to an abortion. Second is that they have shared beliefs, largely instrumental about how to best realize that vision. And third is that they have shared interpretations of politically contested text. These two are going to take a bit more explanation. Halsbrusky's political epistemic network is based on the international relations concept of an epistemic community. The primary difference between an epistemic community and a P.E.N. is the type of knowledge that they deal with. Epistemic communities are composed of members with scientific or technocratic expertise and knowledge, whereas P.E.Ns are composed of members with legal and or political expertise and knowledge.
Hello. Hello. Let's try this. Okay. Law is not like science, and lawyers and judges are not like technocrats. Claims to legal knowledge are non-refutable, always politically contested, and depend more on the authority and power of the speakers and their institutional positions than they do on the persuasiveness or objective truth of the knowledge itself.
Finally, somebody else who gets it. Law isn't a math problem with a set solution. What the law is uncertain and actively contested. That's certainly how our adversarial legal system is designed. But more fundamentally, I don't think there is one singular true meaning of a text, like the Constitution. Words are imperfect, and so are the humans who write and read them. What counts as a speedy trial? What does due process of law mean? The fact that these questions don't have firm answers makes us more likely to rely on heuristics and shortcuts like,
oh, he taught at Georgetown, or she was published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy,
to verify someone's position instead of actually engaging with them on the substance of their claim. The fact that legal knowledge is non-refutable means that political epistemic networks are incentivized to change their beliefs in order to achieve their goals. That's why Halsbrusky calls these beliefs largely instrumental. As she puts it,
Pens can and do modify their beliefs so as to better achieve their normative goals and shared vision of the proper arrangement of social and political life. Thus, beliefs in the P.E.N model should be understood as strategic and instrumental rather than sincere and objectively grounded as they are often characterized in the epistemic community model. What makes the P.E.N beliefs widely held and shared among network members is acknowledged and agreed upon political value.
And that takes us to our final characteristic, a common policy project broadly defined. Again, this one is fairly self-explanatory, but I want to highlight the connections between the characteristic and the two we just talked about, shared instrumental beliefs and interpretations of politically contested texts. The instrumentality of a P.E.N's beliefs necessitates a broad policy project. The way I think about this is the circus tent metaphor. You can imagine the policy project is the tent, and the instrumental beliefs are all of the acts within the tent. At any moment, there are dozens of instrumental ideas duking it out, trying to prove their political viability. You need a big fucking tent to fit all those acts. But if the policy project isn't broad enough to capture a sufficient number of those instrumental beliefs, the P.E.N risks compromising its own viability. Okay, so that's Hollis-Brusky's definition of a P.E.N, but we're still not entirely ready to apply it to FedSoc. First, we need to talk about the American legal system and how law works. Specifically, we need to talk about how major legal changes happen at the Supreme Court. Now, to be clear, the law is so much more than the Supreme Court cases, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to focus on that aspect of the law. Cases like Dobbs, the case that overturned Roe v. Wade, don't just happen. The Supreme Court didn't just wake up one morning and decide to throw out decades of law. That's just not how the law works. As FedSoc members told Hollis-Brusky, Rome wasn't burned in a day. It takes time to change the law, and as we learned earlier, the truth of legal knowledge is based more on the authority, power, and institutional positions of the speaker, rather than the inherent truth or logic of their claim. So, changing the law isn't simply about presenting the universally correct argument. It's about presenting the correct argument for the moment. Or maybe it's about creating a moment where the argument is the correct argument. To match the argument and the moment, you need to understand two other aspects of the law. First, legal decision-making is path-dependent. That is to say, the legitimacy of a legal decision is dependent on its similarity to prior legal precedent or decisions. Hollis-Brusky describes this as doctrinal distance. The validity of a claim decreases the greater the doctrinal distance is between it and existing law. The second thing you need to know about is what we in the business call the giving reasons requirement. This refers to the fact that courts have to provide a written explanation for their legal decisions. Members of Congress don't have to explain their votes. They just vote for what they think is right.
Miss Cinema. No.
For who? I don't know. But they just have to vote. That doesn't fly in court. Instead, you have to provide an explanation that supports and defends the decision. The legitimacy of the decision hinges on the judge's ability to convince an audience of similarly educated and trained lawyers and politicians that their decisions are legitimate. Legitimate legal decisions must either demonstrate that their decision is well situated within the legal precedent or persuade their judicial audience with sufficient justifications for why that precedent should be ignored or entirely reshaped. These factors all come together to make legal decision-making extraordinarily complex. This complexity is in many ways why P.E.Ns exist, as Hollis-Brusky explains.
The logic is straightforward. As decision makers face an increasing number of difficult or complex policy decisions, they will tend to seek support from experts as sources of authoritative knowledge. This opens the door for well-coordinated groups of knowledgeable experts, epistemic communities or political epistemic networks with formal or informal ties to decision makers, to frame, filter, or shape the outcome of the decision-making process according to their own shared beliefs, principles, or values.
That makes sense to me. One of the first things you learn in law school is that good lawyers know when to ask for help. You're not going to be an expert in every area of the law, and even if you are an expert, you'll understand that legal knowledge is constantly changing. There are just some things you can't do on your own. At the Supreme Court, this exchange of ideas is baked into the process. Friends of the court, or amici curiae, submit briefs to the court in an attempt to persuade the court to rule in their favor. Citing epistemic community literature, Hollis-Brusky describes this process as cognitive baggage handling, where legal experts carry the metaphorical baggage of new ideas into the government via their various activities both inside and outside of government. The brief is the suitcase. I can't say case like that. The brief This is ridiculous. The legal brief is like a suitcase full of ideas, and in this situation, they are literally sending it to the court for some poor clerk to read. It's not always as simple or as straightforward as the amicus brief example, but this transmission of ideas is what pens are made to do. As Hollis Bresky says, the goal of the pen is political infiltration.
The more powerful and influential the people who are willing to make a legal argument, the more quickly it moves from the positively loony to the positively thinkable, and ultimately to something entirely consistent with good legal craft.
A great example of this is the rise of originalism and textualism from complete disregard to their positions as the Supreme Court's preferred interpretive methods. This is not a video about originalism or textualism. This video is long enough as it is, but I need to show you that Kagan interview. If you've been to law school, you know what I'm talking about, but for those of you who haven't been, I'll let the video speak for itself.
Hello, everybody. I'm Martha Minow, still the dean, and it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce the Justice Antonin Scalia Lecture. This is a new lecture series. It was established at the law school, and this is only the second one ever to happen, given by an anonymous donor to promote and advance understanding of the founding principles and core doctrines of the United States Constitution.
I thought I'd start by asking, what was statutory interpretation like in our day when we were law students? It was very different from the way we teach statutory interpretation here at Harvard Law School today in 2016. So what was it like from the perspective of the class of 1986?
I'm not sure if somebody said to me statutory interpretation, I would even really quite have known what that meant. I mean, it was not really taught as a subject, as a discipline. You sort of had to pick it up where you could, and here we are in the Scalia lecture, and I would say that Justice Scalia had more to do with this than anybody.
So you said a moment ago that Justice Scalia ushered in a change in attitude. So I guess I'd have two follow-up questions to my last one, which are one, how would you characterize what your court does now, sort of the way of thinking about statutes? What, just in practical terms, when you get a statutory case, how does your court approach it? And then I guess the second is, sort of how do you feel that Justice Scalia, you said that he shaped this more than anyone else. So what do you think how did he shape the way, 8 other justices do business?
Yeah, so I think Justice Scalia is an incredibly important figure in the court in many ways. I mean, we all sort of like to think, oh, we're Supreme Court justices, that kind of,
You are?
The truth of the matter is, you wake up in 100 years and most people are not going to know most of our names. But I think that is really not the case with Justice Scalia, who I think is going to go down as one of the most important, most historic figures in the court. And there are a whole number of reasons for that, which, this is about statutes, so but I think the primary reason for that is that Justice Scalia has taught everybody how to do statutory interpretation differently. And I really do mean pretty much taught everybody. There's that classic phrase that we're all realists now. Well, I think we're all textualists now in a way that just, was not remotely true when Justice Scalia joins the bench.
We're all textualists now. Well, apparently not anymore. Dissenting in West Virginia versus Environmental Protection Agency, Kagan took a markedly different tone from her 2015 Scalia lecture.
Some years ago, I remarked that we're all textualists now. Seems I was wrong. The current court is textualist only when being so suits it. When that method would frustrate broader goals, special canons like the major questions doctrine magically appear as get-out-of-text-free cards.
There's so much more I could say about this quote, about originalism, the major questions doctrine, but that's for another video. Like and subscribe, am I right? The reason I bring Kagan into this is to emphasize the Jack Baldwin quote. Textualism and originalism didn't become the court's interpretive methods of choice based on their merits. Ideas that were literally unthinkable when Kagan was a law student in the early 80s are now entirely good legal craft, because powerful people like Kagan lent their legitimacy to those ideas. The Federalist Society knows this. This transmission of ideas is precisely why they exist. FedSoc serves two key roles with respect to ideas. First, they produce the supply of conservative ideas through conferences, debates, law review articles, prestigious lectures named after FedSoc founders, etc. And second, they manufacture the demand for those conservative ideas through the creation of a judicial audience that actually rewards the adoption of conservative ideas and sanctions those who deviate from the network's goals. Lawyers in the audience may be familiar with what's known as the greenhouse effect. No, I promise it's not the environmental science thing. It's named after Linda Greenhouse, a famous Supreme Court reporter, and it refers to justices' tendency to seek the approval of the liberal media and DC elite on their decisions. Let's hear about the origins of it from Linda herself.
When you talk about the U.S. Supreme Court heavyweights, Linda Greenhouse has to be included on that list because she has been there for 30 years. Not on the court, but in the gallery. When she took over the beat for the New York Times in 1978, Warren Burger was Chief Justice and the court had yet to have its first woman. Her tenure as a reporter on the court has actually been longer than any sitting justice except John Paul Stevens. This summer, nearly 3,000 articles and a Pulitzer Prize later, she is leaving the New York Times. Linda Greenhouse joins us in the studio. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Linda.
In a 1992 speech to the Federalist Society, Lawrence Silberman, who was an appeals court judge, referred to the greenhouse effect, by which he partly meant you and he partly meant activist heat, he said, that the Times legal reporters put on recently appointed justices to try to influence their opinions. It certainly did kind of single you out as being an influential player in the world of the court.
Well, Judge Silberman is given credit for coming up with that snarky phrase, but actually he swiped it from Thomas Sowell, the economist, who had put it in a column shortly before. What that was a dump on Anthony Kennedy, who sits in the seat that was intended in 1987 for Robert Bork, and the Bork nomination failed, and Justice Kennedy ended up sitting there, and it's made a substantial difference.
So Bork is a deep cut for conservatives and FedSoc people in particular. As you heard, they felt like he deserved a seat on the Supreme Court, and liberal activists successfully derailed his nomination. Many conservatives claim that this was the tipping point, the point where the liberals took things too far and brought partisan politics into the entirely nonpartisan, non-political Supreme Court. The liberals had really taken their gloves off with heinous ads like these.
There's a special feeling of awe people get when they visit the Supreme Court of the United States, the ultimate guardian of our rights as Americans. That's why we set the highest standards for our highest court justices, and that's why we're so concerned. This is Gregory Peck. Robert Bork wants to be a Supreme Court justice. But the record shows that he has a strange idea of what justice is. He defended poll taxes and literacy tests, which kept many Americans from voting. He opposed a civil rights law that ended whites-only signs at lunch counters. He doesn't believe the Constitution protects your right to privacy. And he thinks that freedom of speech does not apply to literature and art and music. Robert Bork could have the last word on your rights as citizens. But the Senate has the last word on him. Please urge your senators to vote against the Bork nomination, because if Robert Bork wins a seat on the Supreme Court, it will be for life. His life and yours.
And that meant it was time for conservatives to do the same. They weren't going to get borked again. That's good. Okay. You'll meet him later in this essay, so be on the lookout for that. The liberal plan worked, at least for a moment. Instead of Justice Bork, we got the moderate Justice Kennedy, which did slow some things down. We got gay marriage and everything, but he did retire during the Trump presidency and gave us good old legend Brett Kavanaugh. The confirmation hearing there was Bork 2.0 for conservatives, and they went all out to ensure Kavanaugh was confirmed.
I drank beer with my friends. Almost everyone did. Sometimes I had too many beers. Sometimes others did. I liked beer.
God, he just liked beer! Anyways, the logic behind the greenhouse effect generally went something along the lines of,
The court won't overturn Roe versus Wade because that would be seen as illegitimate by the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and the like.
That example really worked out, didn't it? Anyways, what we're really talking about is judicial audience, and the greenhouse effect fairly accurately captured who the judicial audience was before the rise of the Federalist Society. Today, the Federalist Society and conservative lawyers more generally represent an entirely different judicial audience from the liberal elite of the greenhouse effect. Let's look at some charts and try and apply what we've learned. First up, Table 1.1. Here, Hollis-Brisky compares the criteria of epistemic communities and political epistemic networks before showing us just how well things fit into these boxes. Let's quickly run through this. Criteria 1, a network of professionals with expert knowledge. That would be FedSoc's massive membership network that reaches from law students to the Supreme Court and everything in between. Second criteria, a shared vision of the proper arrangement of social and political life. You don't need me to tell you that conservatives have a shared vision of the proper arrangement of social and political life. But Hollis-Brisky goes a bit further and gives us some useful specifics for FedSoc. These shared beliefs are that the state exists to preserve freedom, and that the role of the judiciary is to say what the law is, and not what the law should be. Those are Hollis-Brisky's words in the table, but really, they're FedSoc's words. You've already heard them say this stuff a dozen times in the clips I've already played, and you're going to hear it a whole lot more. These phrases are dog whistles. They're a way of communicating a political message to members of an in-group without provoking criticism from society more generally. Judges should say what the law is, not what the law should be. It sounds so innocuous, so banal. It feels almost like saying the sky is blue. All of a sudden, you find yourself agreeing with the dude in class who insists on playing devil's advocate every class. That's a whole career for some lawyers. But what you don't realize is that you've unintentionally validated this dude's whole flawed worldview. Even the liberals agree with him now. The conservatives in the room get the reference. They hear the whistle and they know that there's more to it than you think there is. There are a lot more clips in this video, so listen for the whistles. they're hard to miss once you know what they sound like. Criteria 3, shared instrumental beliefs about how to best realize their shared vision. For FedSoc, it's that the separation of powers is central to the Constitution and the precondition for liberty. Again, more words that say almost nothing unless you understand the subtext. On the surface, this is stuff like
judges shouldn't write laws because Congress writes laws.
Which, okay, great, judges don't write laws. But really, what this is saying is
civil rights jurisprudence is fake and made up liberal BS, not real law.
And yeah, big fucking difference from what you probably thought they were saying. And honestly, that's the point. Criteria 4, shared interpretations of politically contested texts. This is where originalism and textualism return. The FedSoc, originalism is the only interpretive method consistent with a proper understanding of the nature of government and the structure of the Constitution. Convenient that your method of legal interpretation is the only valid one. And finally, criteria 5, a common policy enterprise. FedSoc makes this one pretty obvious. We've already heard from them the explicit goal of FedSoc is to promote the awareness and application of conservative legal principles in every aspect of the law. Alright, that's table 1.1. Moving to figure 1.1, we get a nice bar graph showing us who's speaking at FedSoc's major events, and no surprise here, academics make up the largest share of presenters. As FedSoc likes to say, ideas matter. Lastly, we have figure 1.2 showing how FedSoc functions as a pen, exerting influence directly and indirectly on the Supreme Court. Their members infiltrate important political and cultural institutions to distribute and legitimize their ideas, eventually making them law. So there you have it. The Federalist Society is a political epistemic network working to fundamentally change the law to fit their ideological goals. That's probably the best explanation a FedSoc can give you, and it's buried more than 5,000 words deep in this essay. Anyways, now you know what FedSoc is and what they do. For the rest of this video's runtime, we're going to dig into how they do this. Let's hear from FedSoc and my lawyer again. I think we're ready to have a more nuanced takeaway from what we're hearing.
I do not believe that the defense of the Constitution is a casual matter. I believe that it is our most important political work, that the defense of free markets, of our religious freedoms, of the right of parents to pass their values along to their children without the interference of government, and the defense of democracy are all subsumed in the struggle for the Constitution. For me, this is the most important fight, and I believe that the Federalist Society is the single most important addition to this fight in decades.
They really show that a tiny number of people can make a big difference in a very short period of time.
I think the Federalist Society is both intellectually and programmatically the single most important phenomenon in not just legal education. I think it's not hyperbole to say darn near in the law itself today.
One of the first things I asked my lawyer about was her internship at FedSoc's national headquarters. What was it like working with them?
It was so weird because it wasn't long before I really started seeing kind of that underbelly that it was like, okay, I'm uncomfortable a lot of the times that I'm here. So I was only one of 2 female interns, the rest were boys. But there were 2 that were, I think, fresh out of high school doing like this other program between high school and college. They were kind of babies. They were very sweet. There was one asshole from William and Mary. So that was kind of the dynamic going into it, where I was often like the only girl there because the other like female, or I guess woman intern, like she had different hours than I did. That was already kind of like iffy for me, just because I'm someone that went to an all girls. Like I'm not used to being, I guess, in a room dominated by men, which is a very privileged thing to say, but it definitely was out of my comfort zone. I think for me it was like a struggle at first because I was like, well, I don't agree with them at all, legally and politically. We're very opposite, but they're nice. Like they do treat me like I'm human. You know what I mean? And so it was kind of like one of those, like, maybe, you know, I can put up with this. It got worse progressively, especially once we got closer to the end of the semester. Not really from the FedSoc people, but really from a couple of the interns. There were definitely a lot of moments where I talked to my roommate and I was like, I don't know if I can keep doing this. Because I feel icky. Like, they knew I had, one of my really good friends was working for the DNC, and they were constantly trying to get me to find out stuff. I'm like, first of all, Betsy, we don't even talk about our jobs unless we're talking about, like, drama. At the same time, it definitely, it felt like I was, like, their like, token liberal that they wanted to use to sort of, not just strengthen, I guess, their like, message and their goals, but it was almost like, I don't know how to explain it, like, we can't be that bad, look. We want other viewpoints, we like having other viewpoints present. Where I was often being condescended, and I knew that from the get-go, like, I mean, I wasn't that naive. At the booth, when I was talking to the woman that talked to me, she was younger. We were really talking about everything else but FedSoc, and I think that's what kind of drew me in. Because, like, we were talking about, you know, life in DC, she was like, from another, like, southern state, so I think we were kind of bonding over, you know, just what it's like to go from the South into, like, especially a metropolitan area. You know, some certain stereotypes following you around. And then, like I said, like our mutual love of Hamilton and that kind of thing. And at the time, I also still very much bought into the Supreme Court as an institution. I think that's also was pretty significant. I really did believe in like the good of the Supreme Court and that it was capable of, really making a lot of changes. This was 2017, so this is not long after Obergefell. This is right after like they upheld affirmative action. The nosedive that we saw basically from 2017 forward, which by the way I was at FedSoc when we submitted the name for Neil Gorsuch, so that's a fun fact. All of that hadn't really happened yet. So I think for me, I was more willing to believe that as a think tank, that it was just a matter of a difference of opinion, like a legal opinion. It was really once we got into the weeds, I would say probably within a month or so, when it really started becoming clear that this was not a group that I was comfortable being a part of at all.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Well, that's the warmest welcome I've received in September in quite some time. I'd like to thank so many of my friends, and especially my good friend Leonard Leo, for such a warm welcome and wonderful introduction.
How far we've come these last 8 years, not only in transforming the operations of government, not only in transforming the departments and agencies and even the federal judiciary, but also in changing the terms of national debate. And nowhere is that change more evident than in the rise of the Federalist Society on the campuses of America's law schools.
For generations, there has been a liberal bias in our public schools, our universities, and our law schools. This has produced a very overwhelming and pervasive liberal bias in our legal profession, particularly among those who are activists, who are organized, and who seek to influence our society and our legal institutions.
And in this, of course, you've had multitudes of friends and supporters in our administration, and that includes a certain tenant of a nearby unit of public housing.
I hate this dude. The gall to make a joke about the president being a tenant of public housing while doing his best to completely undermine public housing, American housing, and all I have to say is
The actual people of FedSoc, they were always very kind to me. They treated us very well. They took us to lunches constantly. They paid for us to go to a conference in New York, which was exciting. It's like I wasn't ever really going to New York all that often.
whose undergraduate internship pays for you to go from DC to New York? Like, where do you get that kind of money? How could I forget?
And they were very much like, you all should get to experience this stuff and all, like very, very kind. It was the comments that would happen around. It was the discussions around, like LGBTQ rights that were happening at the coffee maker. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't directed at me. It were just these conversations where someone would just say something and it was like jarring because that was so casual.
Existing groups that in all candor, and I don't mean in any way to disparage them, but basically feel like they have some kind of a perpetual lease on commitment to civil rights and on how to go about correctly thinking about civil rights.
Like the cracks in the facade of it, like where it would just slip through, and it was like a double take. And sometimes they would say stuff, and they would almost like look to me like waiting for me to agree, and I'd be like, well, no, I don't agree with that. And then they would kind of like, oh, okay, let's change subjects, moving on.
I keep wondering about the liberals.
And I got pushed back. I mean, I really got into it with one of the interns over like trans rights and stuff, just based on the language that he was using to describe trans people, which I took very I have a bunch of friends that are trans. I have family members who are trans.
Today, you are vexing the dogmatists of the left.
And the language that he was using was just so offensive and derogatory. Like even the high school between high school college interns, they were calling him out, and I felt very grateful to them at the time. They were like, you need to stop. You're making her uncomfortable. And it felt more like if they didn't really care about what was being said, I think they cared more about how it was affecting me. So I think that's an important nuance. They were 18 and stuff, but I appreciate them, I think, coming to have my back a bit on that, but it wasn't so much as they agreed with what I was saying. We want to diffuse the situation a bit. So I think that's what was so weird about it, and it was one of those things where there's a lot of reflection afterwards, where it was kind of sifting through everything that had happened in the semester and really categorizing it as, this is what the conversation really was. I wasn't valued as much as I was just there to kind of bolster this image that they want to project of, we consider all sides. And like I said, the people there, they were very nice, but it was such a weird culture. I never got into, I could see that it was gilded, the organization itself. I saw what that kindness was covering up, especially, I think it helped having people outside of FedSoc who could kind of say, you should be wary of this. So I'm grateful on that end. I'm not naive, especially with the speakers that I would research. Like, I could see what they were saying. I could see what their policies were. I could see what they advocated for.
What FedSoc is doing is more than just impacting interpersonal relationships. They're capturing powerful institutions and changing the rules so only they can win. That's why debates for suckers.
The Federalist Society presently has two primary divisions providing leadership to the legal profession: the Student Division and the Lawyers Division. Today's Student Division has chapters at more than 80 schools, and membership has climbed above 2,000 law students. The Student Division serves several fundamental purposes. First and foremost, of course, it serves to give conservative legal principles a visible presence on campus. The Society's regular national lecture series, called the John M. Olin Lectures in Law, provided local student chapters a chance to host the best conservative legal minds in the country and helps recruit new members. The Student Division publishes a biannual law journal called the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. The Student Division also sponsors an annual national symposium on an important legal topic.
I had gotten to know a little bit about the Federalist Society when I was actually in Washington as an undergraduate Cornellian, because there's this thing called the Cornell in Washington program. And I got introduced to the Federalist Society a little bit down there and decided that when I came to Cornell Law School, if it didn't have the Federalist Society presence, I was going to try to set up a chapter. And so I started that year with a group of other students. While I intended on practicing law at some point and did briefly, I ended up at the Federalist Society long term and really have spent most of my years there really just building a pipeline or infrastructure of talent to help to build out the legal culture in our country.
We decided early on that to present conservative ideas, if we just had people come in and speak about them, you'd get a limited audience. And we thought, let's present both sides.
They wanted me to do a lot of the research and question prep for a lot of their guest speakers, which I was 20 years old, and so at the time, the way that they explained it, they were like, well, we really value your insight because you do ask very tough questions. Because I didn't hold back on these speakers. I didn't like them. I would read what they were talking about or what they stood for, and it pissed me off, so I would get very pointed with my questions. And I had a good, I wouldn't say good understanding of the law at the time, but I mean, at that point, I was about a year into my common law minor, so I kind of had some of that basis already established.
The list of speakers and presenters of these annual symposia and other society events is impressive and influential, and includes such figures as Chief Justice William Rehnquist, Milton Friedman, Professor Richard Epstein, Judge Frank Easterbrook, and Judge Richard Posner.
From the beginning, the seminars that I've had anything to do with or attended, sponsored by the Federalist Society, have indeed presented both sides, and I think that's quite important.
I was my lawyer if debate mattered. I know I thought it mattered at one point when I also thought I was just a straight dude. There's seemingly more leftist debate bros, girls, and non-binaries on the internet day by day, so I have to hope that they think that what they're doing matters. Though I do have my reservations about some of them. Try my last video for a little bit more of that, but let's ask the lawyer. Did she think debate mattered?
I think so. At the time, I put them on the spot, really make them, in my mind, it's make them think. So I still, like I said, I was 20 years old. I had kind of that, maybe they haven't considered this perspective, not realizing that they don't care. So even if they did consider it, they probably have. They don't give a shit enough about it. So at the time, it was kind of I can ask these hard questions. I can put them on the spot. But I think there was some degree of, maybe I can get them to admit that this is all bullshit, or that they're evil, kind of in the middle of this. And I think what was the most jarring for me was going to that New York conference.
I have committed myself to doing everything I can to help the Federalist Society, making the Federalist Society as much of a household word and a far better influence than the ACLU. As you can see, I'm committed.
ACLU leaders and spokespeople are regularly invited to speak at forums and programs and debates and panels that are organized by the Federalist Society.
And I think that's the way you exchange and grow and you get outside of yourself a little bit. And I think the Federalist Society has done that, not only at the law schools, but I think nationwide.
So FedSoc did this really smart, and I use that term in quotations, smart thing where they would always have one liberal speaker in their panel. And then that liberal speaker would just get dogged the entire time. And I think for me, it was just jarring to realize the people, we were at Columbia Law School. So it was the Columbia chapter of FedSoc. And being surrounded by law students who would openly cheer at the liberal speaker for just saying what is honestly probably the most neutral, middle of the road shit
I think that this court is not a conservative court. I think it is a radical court that is radically tearing up by the roots established principles. Here I turn for a definition to that great political philosopher Ronald Reagan, who said that his view of conservatism was getting the government off the backs of the American people. I thought that was a pretty good definition. And has this court done that? Hardly. For example, warrantless, suspicionless, mass, random urinalysis drug testing. You have to urinate in a bottle in front of a government agent if you are going to keep a job or get a job in certain government agencies without any basis to believe that you have abused drugs or indeed that anybody in your agency has. This is hardly getting the government off our backs.
Okay, well then it's a feebly conservative court intermittently, or a radical out of control, revolutionary radical conservative Supreme Court. Do you agree with all of that, Judge Bork?
I agree with everything everybody said. But if you look at the present court, I think you have at least one conservative. I think you have several mild liberals and several rather pungent liberals. And I think, for example, that I would classify Scalia as pretty much of an originalist. And I know he's viewed as a conservative, but I don't think he is. I think he's an originalist. I think Thomas may be becoming that too. So that I don't think you should put those people on a category of liberal or conservative on a spectrum. You should ask whether their originalism is in fact plausibly done.
May I ask Judge Bork a follow-up question?
Of course.
Who are the pungent liberals, and what is the particular aroma?
Well, let me just say this. I argue up there from time to time, twice last year. I do not intend to answer that question for that reason.
Liberals go to these events all the time. The charitable interpretation is that people like Nadine, a former president of the American Civil Liberties Union, go to these debates thinking that they're there to change minds. That they're going to be the one, after all of these years, to irrefutably prove conservatives wrong and show them the light of liberalism. That's a bit sarcastic, and there's certainly more nuance to why people think debate is a useful exercise. Somehow, despite failing at this game for decades, seemingly well-intentioned people are lining up like Charlie Brown to kick the football.
I'm Lena Khan, I'm chair of the Federal Trade Commission, and I'm here at the National Lawyers Convention. I just finished doing a fireside chat with Professor Todd Sawicki, where we talked about antitrust and threats to liberty and the ways in which strong antitrust and anti-monopoly can ensure that we have key rule of law values and we're not allowing a handful of gatekeepers to pick winners and losers in ways that can threaten those liberties. It was a terrific discussion, and I'm just so grateful for the open-hearted and open-minded chat.
Like we learned earlier, law isn't science. Claims to legal knowledge are non-refutable, politically contested, and inherently uncertain. So instead of relying on the merits of a claim, we rely on the authority of speakers and institutions. Inviting high-profile liberals to a debate is a win-win scenario for conservatives because the mere presence of these people and institutions at FedSoc events further entrenches their own status as a legitimate mainstream organization, regardless of the reality that they're peddling the same old conservative bullshit.
He appointed a whole bunch of people in the White House who are Federalist Society members who share his judicial philosophy. In fact, the White House counsel, Don McGahn, once jokingly remarked that we didn't outsource this business, we insourced it. We just brought everybody from the Federalist Society inside the White House. And there's some degree of truth to that. The White House counsel's office, which does this work, is almost fully populated by people who have cut their teeth on the Federalist Society and its debates and its philosophical work.
The other reason liberals get invited is to be the entertainment for the conservatives. You're the joke that brings them closer together. How sweet's that?
And it was like, oh, you guys you feed off of this. You feed off this vile hatred, and you like the idea of oppressing people. You like the idea of stripping people of their rights. It's something that gets you all excited. And that was kind of the big. That was towards the end of the semester, so I think that was the big oh shit moment for me. I'm not doing anything. Nothing that I've researched. None of the questions that I formed for speakers have meant anything because people here don't care how awful the answer is. It's the answer they want to hear.
It's really nice to have a lot of noise made, not by protesters, outside of my house.
And it's the answer they talk about, so. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's accurate. I think I was lucky that I didn't fuck up, honestly. But I don't know if it's because they gave me anything that could have been fucked up, you know what I mean? Because I was only there for a semester. And I definitely played, I think, the sexism to my favor. I'm not gonna lie. Because I've been surrounded by a lot of men. And I know how to work that crowd if I need to. And not anything inappropriate, but smile and oh, thank you so much. They're all the same. In DC, the very first week that I was there, my apartment got broken into. And it was scary. I came out of my room and there was just a guy in my apartment and he chased me out of the apartment, it's on camera, me just booking ass down the stairwell, jumping half the stairs. That's how people were very caring about that. And not in the sense of tell us about like what he looked like. It was more of the, are you okay? Like, do you want someone to walk with you to the station and stuff? I was like, oh no, like, I mean, it was my fault the apartment got broken into. I definitely left the door unlocked accidentally after taking the trash out the night before. Yeah, it was that very like human, like, oh, let's support you, let's have this network for you. But then again, every time that I would accept that, because like, it's a big city, you're young, like you're just trying to find like, I guess, a good foundation, even though you're only there for such a short period of time. It was always like the ugly would creep in so quickly. And it was like these things that they would say, and it was like, oh my god, I think this is the shit that my grandmother says, and like my mom kicks at her under the table. Like, we can't just, we're just spewing it. Like, it's nothing.
We have had not only debates between conservatives and liberals, but lots of debates between different kinds of conservatives, and our membership includes many different kinds of conservatives. Members who feel that the courts should vigorously enforce the original Constitution, even if that means striking down a lot of laws.
C really knows how to say the quiet part out loud. The real debates that go on are between different types of conservatives. The debate was never about if they wanted to get rid of civil rights, it was always about how they did it and how fast it would happen. And with 6 votes on the High Court, it seems pretty clear that things are getting faster.
I don't know, it felt so culty. Like, that is the best way to describe it. It was like being in the beginning of a horror movie like The Purge, and I'm just waiting for the alarms to go on. So I remember distinctly that, like, when Neil Gorsuch's name was submitted for Scalia's seat, I remember the talk at the office, which was, this is the start of how we get Roe v. Wade overturned. This is the start of how we get Obergefell overturned. This is the start of how we walk back all of these landmark cases that came and were like major civil rights issues. And that was the goal. It wasn't that people necessarily genuine. There were a couple like religious wackadoos in there, but they were few and far between compared to people who just wanted to put others like them in powerful positions to push those agendas that they, like, I guess, buy into.
Alright everyone, it's time to say hi to Leonard Leo, former vice president of the Federalist Society and the man behind the curtain when it comes to much of their work and success.
Wow. Well, it all starts on the day of Justice Scalia's death, actually. As some of you may remember, that was also the night of the first Republican primary debate. And so at some point in the very late afternoon, we get a phone call from Don McGahn, who is general counsel to the Trump campaign. And he says, look, this is going to come up in the debate, and Trump wants to mention a couple of names of people who would be the types of folks he would nominate to the court. And we were really fascinated by that and floored by it because that had never happened, right? In all the prior presidential debates, the furthest a Republican candidate ever gone was what George W. Bush said, which was, I'm going to appoint people in the mold of Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia, right? But they were already on the court. So this was different, and this was just downright edgy.
Gross. Ooh, don't say that. Stop.
So really what happens is it's March now of 16, I believe, and I'm invited to come to a lunch in Washington with a group of other people. It's after that lunch where we have our first serious conversation about judicial selection and about the Supreme Court. And then at some point he sprung this idea about the list, right? Hey, I've got an idea. What's that? Well, I want to put out a list of all people from which I would pick a Supreme Court justice. And my immediate reaction to that, being a lawyer, was to say, well, that's never been done before. And so he said, well, is that a reason for not doing it? And I said, well, no, why do you want to do it? And he said, well, nobody knows who I am on this issue. And this is a way of explaining to people what it is I would do in a very clear way. We talked about it a bit, and I had gotten a little bit of a tip-off that this was his idea, so I happened to have a list. And at one point he said, so what kinds of people would you put on that list? I said, well, I happen to have it. Would you like to see it? Yeah, I'd love to see it. We had conversations about what it was he was looking for. And there were 3 things that he stressed. One was what we would call a brand, okay, what he would understand as brand. And so for me, that was like, this is good, okay? But then when he hit the second one, that's when I was really excited, because there he said, I want people who are, quote, not weak. Now, I knew what that meant, okay? We don't want people who hide in the tall grass, okay? So we want people who are going to do what they know is right and are going to be strong and principled, and they are not going to look behind their backs to see how they're getting criticized. And to see a possible president understand the importance of that nature of one's character told me that this could potentially be a really value-added process during this administration. And the third one is what you would expect. I want people who are going to interpret the Constitution the way the framers meant it to be. And I thought that was an elegant way to put it. I don't know whether he came up with that or someone else did, but...
Being a lawyer, they do this so well. They pretend to hold some reasoned position like, oh, this has never been done before. But he already has the list in his pocket because he knew he was going to get asked, and he knew in that conversation what he was going to do. It was going to give Trump a list of lawyers. Lawyers can make anything sound boring. brand, not weak, and the framer's interpretation. Brand and not weak are clearly the most important, and Leo loves it.
And thirdly, and maybe most importantly, is courage. There are lots of really smart people, Margaret, who can serve on the U.S. Supreme Court, dozens and dozens. But you need people who have courage, people who are willing to do what's right no matter what's going to happen in terms of the court of public opinion.
He's just telling us all this, saying exactly what he's doing out loud. It's not about specific policies or differences in jurisprudence, because at the end of the day, these beliefs are merely instrumental.
Conservatives used to discuss Roe v. Wade in the context of a confirmation process, and what conservatives always used to say is, there is no litmus test, right? We're not going to have a litmus test for judges through the confirmation process. And the thing that's different now, it seems to me, is that you have a Republican president who is determined and declared that there is a litmus test for judges. He has said that he will appoint judges who will vote to overturn Roe v. Wade.
The reality is that every president, going back to Ronald Reagan, if not before, has operated under a Republican Party platform that basically said that. So it's nothing new.
They're tools used by the political epistemic network when they're useful and quickly discarded as soon as their utility ends. Their real goal is to make the Federalist Society brand the only legitimate brand of law. Or maybe instead of the word brand, you could think of it as FedSoc wanting to entrench their shared vision of the proper arrangement of social and political life. Now, that sounds familiar, but they won't outright say that. Instead, we get phrases like brand and not weak that don't provoke the moderate sensibilities of someone like Ari Melber. But I guarantee you that the conservatives know what Leonard means. And the funniest bit of all of this is that if you bother to ask, they'll outright tell you what their goals are.
I did question at some point, do you guys really buy into all of this, or is this just your proxy to power? That's what it feels like a lot of the time. And they basically would say, no, we like the prestige. We like being able to have that influence over the Supreme Court, over policy, over law. They weren't shy about that aspect. They would tell you, they were very comfortable telling you exactly what their goals were. It wasn't about, we have a difference in legal analysis. No, it was, I want to get rid of fucking abortion. Or I don't think the gays should be married, therefore we should put someone on the court that also doesn't think the gays should be married.
Law school?
It's a perfectly respectable place, Daddy.
The first year of law school was deliberately designed to destroy students' minds by requiring them to reconcile things that could not be reconciled and to justify an obviously unjust society.
Going to Harvard is the only way I'm going to get the love of my life back.
Oh, sweetheart, you don't need law school. Law school's for people who are boring and ugly and serious. And you, Button, are none of those things.
Law school. The literal worst 3 years of my life, and that's compared to being a deeply closeted transsexual and getting back-to-back in the 2 years prior. I'm not even 25. What am I doing? Not fucking practicing law, that's for sure. Getting back on topic. FedSoc loves law school. That's where these sickos got their start after all. So let's hear from my lawyer about her experience with FedSoc at our good old alma mater, the University of Cincinnati College of Law. And don't take that the wrong way. This isn't a UC thing. This is an everywhere thing. And one last thing. Our first year of law school was in 2020 at the peak of people caring about the pandemic. That's still going on, meaning our first year was entirely remote with the exception of a single, optionally in-person, twice-a-week civil procedure class. Okay, actually my last time interrupting here, I took the time to anonymize parts of this video for a reason. Just because I'm sharing personal experiences does not mean you have an invitation to try and find out more or to find the identity of specific people. That shit isn't cool. We're here to learn and not to harass people. Got it? Thank you.
I do wonder to what extent I think COVID and being completely online made it easier to isolate from it. Because it truly was, I saw that email and I was like, delete. Not fucking with that at all. COVID really, it allowed us, I think, to close off from groups that we didn't want to interact with. And then almost exist in these little echo chambers of the groups that we did want to participate in. Which in some ways is really good because I think that helped for building community in a time where it was really hard to do that, especially in something like law school where we've been fed this tale of how competitive it is and how nuts law students are, especially the first year. Whereas I think our class was kind of unique in the sense that we were all mutually suffering together. I think that we bonded over the shared trauma of that. When that connection aspect is removed from them, they lost a lot of power. Not to say they didn't inflict a lot of damage, they very much did, especially that first semester. Yes, ADF.
The ADF is the Alliance Defending Freedom. We'll get back to them.
So not to say that they weren't capable of inflicting harm, because they did, and that was very evident in school, obviously. Like, there was the letter that was sent out, and, there were, like, these discussions and stuff, and, I also think there was something to be said for the fact that everything was on Zoom, because I think it made those, like, town halls easier to have, where a lot of LGBTQ students, myself included, like, got on and voiced our frustration and outrage at the school. So in that way, I think that helped. I do definitely think that FedSoc's impact was diminished, because there was people had a lot more time, I think, to devote to those conversations, because they were isolated in a way, because you could log off school, or you could just be in class, but you also furiously typing away in the group meetings, doing things that you probably couldn't get away with when you actually be physically in class. So I definitely think that their ability to reach out to people and trying to get that face-to-face is almost critical to their message and to getting that message out there. In my opinion, I think that their effectiveness with it was definitely diluted by the pandemic. But that's my own personal take. Again, I also was very much the type, I don't answer my emails anyway, it was very easy for me to just kind of do away with them and ignore them completely when it was just communication by email. I feel like they were really good at promoting their events in law school. I remember a couple people that would get up in front of class and talk and say hey, we're having this event, we're doing this, come check this out. But then they would always kind of keep it really vague and usually lure people in with the promise of food, which was always very smart to do, because all students are hungry if we don't eat, or coffee and that kind of thing. And it was always, they're going to be 15-minute meetings, they're not going to be that long, you don't have to commit. I definitely saw a lot more of that once that's what I really noticed, is how much more prevalent they were. Their flyers were everywhere. It just felt like they were, as a whole, a lot louder, but also really good at drumming up interest. And part of me wonders if it was if there's some mystique in the controversy that drew people into, people, you hear about all this shit with FedSoc, and your interest gets piqued a little bit, so you want to go check it out, and then maybe that leads to more people wanting to join it, because then they hear the bullshit that maybe they've kept quiet to themselves for who knows how long. I definitely think that they were much more efficient at doing that outreach, but again, never fully saying what they were doing until you got to the meeting with them and then really listened.
So being annoying in class isn't a sin, and I know I'm far from innocent when it comes to talking too much during a law school class. I'm so glad to be free. But FedSoc does more than that. I asked my lawyer to tell me about any incidents she remembered FedSoc causing while we were in law school. I have more stories, but those would be hearsay. Please don't hurt me legally.
Okay, so then there's a big one, first semester of law school, which was inviting the ADF speaker onto campus.
For those of you lucky enough to not know who the ADF is, they're listed as an anti-LGBTQ hate group on the Southern Poverty Law Center's website. To name just a few of their terrible positions, the ADF has publicly advocated for the recriminalization of consensual sex between LGBTQ adults and the forced sterilization of transgender people, a fun group to invite to campus.
Hello, Edmund Clementine here. If you want more on the ADF, go check out Late Stage Live with Ellie Yerman, or check out this episode from Zoe B. Both are really good. Thank you.
And the other thing is, they didn't just choose any old ADF speaker. They chose a real piece of work by the name of Jordan Lawrence, warning for homophobia and transphobia. Feel free to skip this dude. I'll make it work somehow.
My name is Jordan Lawrence with the Alliance Defense Fund, and we have copies of a letter that we sent to President Obama and Secretary Gates pointing out the threat to religious liberties for military chaplains posed by this proposal. This change in policy will negatively affect military readiness by creating a conflict of conscience for military chaplains. For one of the first times in American history, there will be an open conflict between the virtues taught by the chaplains and the moral message delivered by the military. Many chaplains and most major religions define marriage as one man and one woman, and also teach that certain types of sexual activity are morally wrong. Forcing chaplains to deny their faith on these matters in order to serve in the armed forces is a great threat to the religious freedom and the right of conscience protected by the First Amendment.
So this dude has been a hardcore homophobe on camera for 10 plus years, and he's still got the invite to campus. You know what you're getting when you invite this dude onto campus. I was like, what in God's name is going on with Jordan's 5 shirts in the gay Pentagon? This dude sure spends a lot of time thinking about gay people, but he's not done yet.
I mean, to the point now where I just filed a case against a public school in Minnesota for there's a guy who says he's a girl trapped in a guy's body, and they're letting him go into the girls' locker rooms. And the girls were representing the girls who were saying, we just do not want to be dressing and undressing in front of a biological male who kind of does these, kind of Miley Cyrus strip pole kind of things in the locker room with these girls, and he's definitely a biological male. And I'm concerned, like, what if they start saying you have to call this guy a woman, and and you're going to get sanctioned by the court if I don't do that? I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we're facing more and more of, those types of things.
Yep, he's really transphobic too. Just another dude who's making shit up about trans people and sexualizing a fucking high school girl, saying she's trying to do Miley Cyrus strip pole kind of things. What are you talking about? It's pretty fucking weird to talk about a high school girl like that in front of an audience and on camera. Also, whoever chose to cut to that dude in the audience, God, these people are the worst. And this is the debate and free speech conversation that FedSoc wants to have on campus? I can't think of a bigger waste of my time.
Fall semester of 2020. This is after everything started going on with, the LGBT, like the ADF stuff. After con law, I decided to say afterwards, and decided to speak. And he spent about 10 minutes talking about, the need for speech and the planning that goes into these events and talking and I, as soon as he started going into, we take the speaker, we book speakers that we can get to talk about issues that, that are important, that are salient. And I was like, oh, okay, let's talk. So I waited, and I was like, I'm going to speak to something that said. And then I went into about how I had worked for FedSoc, I had worked at their corporate, or like their national headquarters. I wasn't mean, because I know better. But I basically said, like, I know the resources that the Federalist Society has. They have an exorbitant amount of money. They have endless lists of speakers at their disposal that they will happily send to whatever requesting institution that wants them. This was intentional. This was a speaker that was chosen specifically because of how controversial that he is, and I would not be surprised if it was done intentionally in order to drum up this exact kind of controversy, so that the FedSoc can clutch their pearls and say, but freedom of speech, we need to let all ideas talk. The second that anybody voiced any sort of disagreement or expressed any discomfort with the fact that it was that particular speaker. And again, I cut my tone very respectfully. Like, I know how to speak respectfully when I really want to just curse someone out. Messaged me afterwards and said, like, hey, I just want to thank you for your perspective. And I really appreciated you going, like, engaging in dialogue with me. And it was like, okay. I was like, okay. Like, he was like, hey, I really appreciated you, like, offering that. Like, and I was like, so it was a nothing sandwich, like, no substance whatsoever. And I think I was, like, shit-talking him with words. Like, we were like, girl, you went off on him. Thank you so much, because I could not listen to him speak anymore. It was such, like, a pre-recorded kind of message. Like, it didn't feel genuine in the slightest. But it was always almost, like, sickly kind, like, in a way that made me uncomfortable. Whenever I would see, like, I would talk to him on campus and stuff, and he almost looked, like, surprised that I was speaking to him. Like, he expected me to curse him out or something.
Same.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's just I don't think that's the vibe I gave off. I feel like that, like, soft voice and kind of almost like the explaining voice, and it just ground my gears so hard. And I don't know if that's because I, like, haven't taught and I hate it when teachers talk to students like that, and my students would call my ass out for speaking to them like that. But it really got under my skin, I think, because to me that was, but it's funny because that, his fake kindness was exactly, was like the real, it was the real image of FedSoc. Like, that's all it is. A lot of it is fake. Like, I do think there are people in there that are genuinely going to be kind to those that are around them. As a whole, that is not what FedSoc is. It is not a genuinely kind think tank that cares for the people in and around it. It is still always going to be pushing that ulterior agenda.
But FedSoc sins don't end here. I wonder what else my lawyer remembers.
I don't know if this can really be fully attributed to FedSoc. I just think they're guilty by proxy because the person was in FedSoc. So in one of the 1L property classes, they were watching a video on the Fair Housing Act. I guess this was a Zoom class because this was 2022, so we were back in person, but I guess they were having a remote class. And in the Zoom chat, a 1L meant to direct message another student, like a friend in the class, and accidentally sent it to the whole class chat, and it was an emoji of Black Santa and watermelon, and that was it. It was pretty, the racial connotations there was no ambiguity about it. The implication being that the Fair Housing Act was a handout to Black people as a way to give them free housing, and the worst punishment that he got was he was not allowed to go to the law school prom.
Not a whole lot to say here besides, wow, that's pretty goddamn racist. You probably don't need me to tell you why the Fair Housing Act isn't a handout to Black people, but because I'm working in housing right now, I'm the wrong bitch to cross on this one. The FHA does not give anyone housing, nor does it provide anyone with the affirmative right to housing. I think it should, but that doesn't change the fact that it doesn't. The Fair Housing Act is outlaw housing discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex and gender identity, familial status, or disability. So again, we have people just making shit about the law to justify their racist behaviors and ideas. And the fact that the only punishment was not going to the law school prom says all it needs to say about the legal profession's willingness to take racism within its own ranks seriously. Beyond law students, though, what about the professors who are part of FedSoc? You'd think they know better, right? That they wouldn't let stuff like this happen.
So there are several specific incidents that come to mind. I will say, with regards to Professor, I find it hard to not criticize. I have no issue criticizing him, and I did criticize him. Professor was a very kind person to me when he was being diagnosed. Because that semester was incredibly rough. It was like every other day, having to go to the hospital and then wouldn't come home for at least a week or longer. It was very hard. And Professor was one of the professors, I think, that really met with me a lot outside of class and just talked. Because he had lost his cancer his first year. And that was something that I needed, I think, and kind of that support, because there was a lot of empathy that I got. And he was the first to say, like, you are off the hook for the rest of the semester in terms of class participation. He's like, you already participate, like, very well. He's like, so you're good. If you want to participate, that's fine. He was like, you tell me what you need in terms of due dates, and we'll work with it. I not to say like I'm his biggest defender, but so like I remember before I diagnosed, I like stayed after with Professor about 40 minutes talking about gay marriage and about kind of like this higher level of generality thing that we had discussed in con law. I did kind of needle him a bit, and he eventually like admitted, he was like, I voted in support of the Ohio amendments to allow for same-sex marriage. He's like, I do support it personally, and I think that for me was kind of like my, well, if you support it personally, why is it then that, but you can in the same breath say, but I don't think the law supports it. The law is fake. Like, let's be real. We just make up words and we call it law. And that's, and then we let people figure it out, I guess, 100 years from now, what the fuck we were talking about. Like, at the highest level of generality, that's what the Constitution is. That squared with that notion of FedSoc for me. It was, well, personally, I do support this. However, I'm going to also support institutions that actively make this harder. And the way that he phrased it was, someone needed to be the faculty advisor for FedSoc. Like, that's how he portrayed it to me. It was like, I don't even support FedSoc. I'm just here because they needed a faculty advisor, which I thought was interesting. I don't know if that's true or not. So, that was like one of the biggest examples, I think, of that, again, that humanity, the compassion, the empathy, the genuine care and consideration that he was showing for not only like my mental well-being, but also my academic well-being, because he was very flexible with me getting assignments in
My lawyer's experience here lines up really well with my own experiences with this professor. He was always exceedingly kind to me, he offered some of the most valuable academic feedback I've ever received, and he undoubtedly made me a better student. But I also know that the experience is rooted in privilege. To say nothing of the privilege involved with being a full-time law student at 20 years old, I was also perceived as a straight cis white guy. I don't know if things would have worked out the same if this version of me was the one going to law school. Even if I was treated the same, it still wouldn't explain or excuse the commitment to upholding and recreating systems of oppression.
So I guess my last question. At FedSoc, do you think they care more about ideas or more about winning?
Winning. Definitely winning. I mean, they will take the idea that they think is going to be the winning idea, but they don't actually care about the substance of those ideas. They care enough about it to talk and to at least put forth convincing arguments to sway the population in their favor. But beyond that, if they think it doesn't matter how sound of an explanation you give, it doesn't matter what kind of resources you have to back it up. If they don't think it's going to sell or land with whatever goal, or if it's not going to push the goal or ultimately help them meet it, they don't care.
I think 100 years from now, the Federalist Society will be known for having reset the terms of debate within the legal system and for having revived an appreciation for our constitutional structure.
In all these clips, Leo and the other members of FedSoc make one thing incredibly clear. They're in it for the long game. Sure, there are battles to win today, but they see the conflict for what it is, a 100-year-long war that they have no intention of losing. The other thing that's abundantly clear is that this doesn't end in the courtroom. It's not about fixing courts or getting judges to play their proper role in a system of checks and balances. It's about the political, cultural, and societal changes that result from capturing our legal institutions. These broader goals are both implicit to FedSoc's existence as a political epistemic network and increasingly explicit as the conservative legal movement further captures and entrenches itself within our legal and political institutions. Listen to Leo as he talks about his new venture, Teneo.
I spent close to 30 years, if not more, helping to build the conservative legal movement. And at some point or another, I just said to myself, well, if this can work for law, why can't it work for lots of other areas of American culture and American life where things are really messed up right now? Wokeism in the corporate environment, in the educational environment, one-sided journalism, entertainment that's really corrupting our youth. Why can't we build talent pipelines and networks that can positively affect those areas as well?
Wow. All right, that video is really a who's who of modern conservatism, from the references to wokeism in the corporate and educational environments to PragerU and Tucker Carlson clips, and even featuring some of our favorite assholes, from my senator, J.D. Vance, to failed presidential candidates Vivek Ramaswamy and Ron DeSantis. There's a lot of money and influence behind this effort, at least $1.6 billion. Come on, those motherfuckers don't show up for free. If you need evidence for that, just take one look at this letter from Clarence Thomas, crying about how he might quit being a Supreme Court justice if he doesn't get paid better. And you can probably guess what the Republicans did next. Of course they paid him. Getting back to Teneo, let's hear from their CEO, Evan Baird, about how Teneo got started and what his vision for the organization is.
And I want to tell you that story now about what Teneo is and how you guys fit into that story. So it was 11 years ago. I was at this fairly uninviting Baja Fresh in DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. I was working for Peter Thiel, building a political data company. And as we were sitting there, Peter and I thought a lot about sort of the state and the future of the conservative and libertarian movement. And we were very familiar with the Federalist Society, and we're so deeply impressed with the ability of FedSoc, as it's nicknamed, to cultivate a real values-aligned community within the area of law.
So let's imagine a world in which Tenayans serve in the House and the Senate as governors. One might be elected president. They've founded dozens of successful companies, partners at leading VC firms, sit in tenured faculty positions at elite universities, produced box office hits, and launched dozens or hundreds of strategic and winsome ideological projects. But also imagine a world where, for some, we're in healthy marriages with thriving children, making smart financial decisions, investing in our skill sets, and leading civically. I love the line earlier today, which I will hold on to for a long time. is that we don't just do success together, we do life together. So, yeah, let's clap to that. That's good.
We don't just do success together, we do life together. I feel like that says it all. They want to control everything, from your politics to your job, all the way to your family. These people want to be in charge of your life. Just like FedSoc and dozens of other AstroTurf conservative advocacy groups, Teneo is another political epistemic network hell-bent on reconfiguring society to their liking. Now you know what they're doing and how they're doing it. You don't have to treat them like serious, well-intentioned people, because clearly they aren't. Now, I want to be clear, you should take the danger that their ideology poses seriously. There's a reason this video exists besides being the product of months of monotropic fixation. I want you to walk away knowing that these people are deeply unserious assholes, willing to change their beliefs at the drop of a hat, and simultaneously a giant fucking threat to the way all of us live our lives. I don't have a silver bullet solution for any of this, but I hope this has helped you see what's going on and sparked a bit of the courage you'll need to challenge it. On a recent episode of Citations Needed podcast, episode 198, how the Atlantic magazine helped sell austerity and war to middle-brow liberals. God, I love this podcast. On the podcast, John Schwartz made a fantastic point about powerful people and their sense of seriousness.
Something Adam and I talk about a lot is this idea of seriousness. So before we let you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the kind of seriousness vibe of the Atlantic, why it takes itself so seriously, why it needs everyone else to consider it so, seriously in this space.
Yes, well, this is a core part of the self-conception of anybody with power, which is that they are the serious, rational ones, and then the rest of us are these, irrational children who are out of our minds running around far below them on the planet, the surface of planet Earth. And they have this Olympian view from 40,000 feet. I mean, it is funny. It's just uniform. It's a uniform perspective of people with power. And there's nothing they hate more, in my experience, than making jokes about them. Because they have the money, they have the guns, but they do not have any jokes. And it drives them crazy. Like, they themselves are not funny people. They have no defense when you make a joke about them. And the commentary track to the movie Life of Brian, Michael Palin talks about this, and he says, I've always thought revolutionaries should use jokes more, because this is a very potent weapon that the people in charge cannot fight back against.
These people aren't serious, and they don't deserve to be treated seriously. To be extremely clear, what they're doing has serious consequences, and those consequences are often deadly for marginalized people. But the severity of the consequences doesn't make these people more intelligent, rational, or serious. And nothing gets under these people's skin more than your refusal to take their bullshit at face value. They literally cannot stop making stuff up about the world, and they will throw the biggest fit if you question them in the slightest. I don't know about you, but I think that's pretty fucking funny. All the power in the world, and you're mad I asked a follow-up question? And you don't even have to be mean about it. Listen for the underlying assumptions they're making and question those assumptions. Is everyone convicted of a crime actually guilty? Is something being legal the same thing as it being ethical or morally good? It takes time, but this is a muscle you can build, and before you know it, the FedSoc people won't know how to handle you. And you speaking up might be enough for someone else to feel like they can do the same. In my book, that kind of small action is enough. That's living your politics in a more tangible way than voting ever will be. So next time you feel yourself about to agree with a FedSoc bro, take a second and think about what he's getting out of it. And the same goes for agreeing to debate a conservative or showing up on some right-wing event or on their show, particularly if you have any kind of platform or societal legitimacy. These people don't care about you. They're using you for their own ends. You might know that already, and you might be thinking, no, see, I can do it. I can use them for my goals because I know they're trying to use me. And that logic's fundamentally flawed because it ignores the real reason you're there. They want your legitimacy. They desperately need your presence and participation to validate and reinforce their own legitimacy. There's nuance to all of this, and reasons you might nonetheless decide to go. Like, I am not here to critique Deja or to critique Olemi. They made choices, and I kind of agree with their choices. None of it matters what I think about what they did. The bigger point is that these people and institutions won't need you forever. Eventually, something like a 6-3 court happens, and suddenly it doesn't matter whether Justice Kagan thinks we're all textualists or not. They have the votes to achieve their broader ideological goals, and accordingly, they abandon their instrumental beliefs and any pretense of caring about what you have to say. The Federalist Society isn't your friend. Wow. Thank you for watching. This was an extremely long video, and it took me far longer than I ever expected to research, write, and produce. If you liked it or learned something, you sharing this video would mean the world to me. I don't need to drag this out any longer. So I'm going to end on a big thank you to everyone at F the Algorithm. Y'all got me over 100 subscribers and cared enough to talk about this tiny little channel. The care and consideration meant more to me than you'll ever know. I think that's a happy enough way to end the video. Thank you for watching. I'm Clementine or Suzaka, and I'll see you here soon enough. Please, 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 good enough. I don't want to record this for a third time.